Good afternoon and welcome to a sunny virtual Corporate Renewables 2020. I'm Zosia Riesner and I'm Director of Power Markets at Lightsource BP. Today I'm going to be presenting a discussion looking at developments in the corporate PPA market by comparing and contrasting the US and Europe to see what we can learn. Lightsource BP is a global solar developer. We are currently active in 13 countries around the world, and my team is responsible for developing and implementing our route to market strategy, and corporate PPAs form an essential and integral part of that. So for the conversation today, I thought it'd be interesting to have a conversation with Emily Wangerman, who is Vice President of Business Development at Lightsource BP in the US, see what insight we can gain. So thank you very much for having this conversation with me today. I thought I'd start by asking you a little bit about the types of clients that you're seeing showing interest in buying long-term PPAs, specifically focused on corporate clients.
Sure. I'm happy to have this conversation. So for corporate clients, we have different types of corporate clients across the US. We have clients that are used to procuring solar. And so these are larger, not just solar, but any renewables. These are larger players, the Googles, the Apples, Microsofts, groups like that. And, the contracts that they do can vary, right? So they can do things like virtual PPAs, which are contract for differences. They also do proxy gen PPAs or other forms of PPAs. At the end of the day, what they're trying to do is do a combination of getting the renewable energy component of it as well as the cheap power. Sometimes they don't even need the power itself. It's really focused on the renewable energy component of the product. And then there's a lot of new players in the market, and they're very mixed. There's some smaller players, and the way that we handle those is sometimes they get aggregated together, and so one project can serve multiple customers. And then there's larger players that are surprising and aren't necessarily engaged in the market in the past, that are starting to get engaged because of the affordability of solar. And so a good example for us, two good examples for us are Everas Steel. This is a project that we did in Colorado. It's one of our largest projects across the globe. And it's actually a sleeve through Xcel, which is a large utility in the US. And we are contracting with Xcel. And then Xcel is contracting with Everas. And the great thing about that is Everas benefits from not only the low cost solar, but also from the renewable energy components. And so it's helping them greatly reduce their overall emissions impact. And it's just a great community engagement because they're also committing to staying in the community for the long run and providing local jobs in Colorado. So that's a really great example of a partnership across us, a utility, and the corporate. Another good example is SEPA, which is Southeastern Pennsylvania Transit Authority. It's a large transit authority outside of in Philadelphia and the surrounding area. And we've contracted with them for renewable energy that's located in southeastern Pennsylvania. And then they're going to use that renewable energy the renewable energy credits to help reduce their overall impact, their carbon impact. And so they're excited about that because it's going to directly impact reducing the carbon impact on their transportation.
So one thing I'm always very jealous of is the scale of the projects that you talk around in the US, mentioning the project with Everas there, that's I think 300 megawatts, whereas for us in the UK, we're typically looking at sort of 5 to 10 megawatts for private wire schemes. Can you talk a little bit about the term you're seeing and durations of PPAs? I think we've reflected on Europe, where we've seen sort of durations typically were about 10, 15, 12 years and sort of started off probably a few years ago towards the longer end of that, shortening now probably to 10 to 12 being the sweet spot. What kind of term of PPAs are you negotiating with corporates at the moment?
Great question. So I would say the tenor is going down. And so it kind of depends on who the customer is. The utilities still tend to procure on the longer term. So we look at 20, 25-year PPAs with utilities. But on the corporate side, we are seeing tenors that are 15 years, 12, 10. Typically, I'd say the average is still around 15 years, but that is going down probably and starting to trend towards 12. For us, there is a unique component of the way that we finance projects is a combination of tax equity because of the investment tax credit, which is a federal subsidy, and debt. And so with that, there is some benefits of maintaining that longer term project, but so longer tenor term. But the only issue becomes that as you balance how much merchant revenues you can get for the project versus the contracted revenues. And so, it really at the end of the day is how do you make the project financeable? And then how do you also work with your customer to address the fact that a lot of the customers, especially corporates, typically don't like to do long-term contracting. And for the fact that they're not really sure where their load is going to be in the long run. They might choose to move a facility, or they might choose to ramp up a facility or decrease the capacity of that facility. And so they like that flexibility. And so we're really balancing our ability to finance a project and get the required long-term committed cash flows that help with our financeability of the projects, as well as their ability to flex. And so it's really a balancing act there.
So, Emily, US is, as we talked about before, a massive market. So there are many different markets within the US market. And similarly, we have Europe, which is many countries, many markets. One thing that we're noticing is that it's not necessarily efficient, both from a pricing and a contractual perspective, for corporates to negotiate PPAs in every single European country. And we're seeing a rise in interest in what we call pan-European PPAs or multi-country PPAs, where maybe buyers are looking to fulfill their needs from where resources are more productive. So potentially, although it's very sunny here today, it's not always sunny in the UK. So solar from Southern Europe, from Iberia, where there's kind of scale and high irradiance levels, good yield. Hydro from Northern Europe potentially, or indeed offshore wind from the UK. And then by adopting a multi-country approach, there are new risks that are introduced, such as intercountry basis risk. So the risk of settling virtually in one market and actually being exposed to demand in other markets. Is that something that's familiar to you in the US, and have you seen solutions to that within the contracts that you've seen there?
Definitely. I'd say that's a pretty standard way to contract, especially with corporates. And so we have different markets, they're wholesale markets, regional transmission organizations are what they're called. And those cut across the entire US. And so one is called PJM, another is called ERCOT, another is called MISO. And so with that, those have many states within them. And well, ERCOT's one very large state, but it's Texas. But within MISO, there's many states in the Midwest, and then on PJM, it's the Mid-Atlantic, which is in the East Coast. And the benefit of that is that you can have inexpensive generation. This is actually why these overall organizations were created, was you can have inexpensive generation supplying from other regions to areas of high load or high demand. And so that still exists as it relates to contracts as well. And so what we'll see is that we can supply someone, let's say, we could supply a corporate like a Google, and if they know they have a lot of load in spreading across PJM, so into Virginia and Pennsylvania and things like that, but they really want a lot of generation. What they'll do is they can take a project from us, let's say in Indiana or Ohio, to serve that load, and it's a real benefit. But you're right, as soon as you introduce, you're separating out where the generation is relative to the load, you are introducing what's called basis. And so it does put a risk in there that there can be different prices in those different regions. And so typically the way we handle that is we price it in. And then you try to reduce that risk through basically increasing the price to account for that risk. And then also, in the event that there's a really negative position and it's very, very different, you look to be able to either curtail the project or find a way to move that project settlement to the actual location of where that generation is. So you don't lose the benefit of generating, but you're reducing that risk of that very different price structure.
One thing that comes out for me there is the first thing you said was we look to price it in, we look to solve that problem and take that risk. And that's for me, over the past few years, something that I've noticed in contrasting Europe and the US, where typically in Europe we've seen buyers absorb certain risks, as a standard position, say shape and imbalance risk, basis risk. Um, and I think in the US, where it's maybe been a more established market and slightly more competitive, it's maybe become the norm that many of those risks are borne by the project, not the buyer. And solutions are embedded within the PPA to some of these risks, more so than necessarily we saw historically in the UK. Maybe some of the newer markets have skipped to the front of the queue and are already solving some of those. So, whereas as generated maybe standard in the UK and Spain, we might expect to see baseload as a requirement from a corporate.
Yeah.
Feedback I've had sort of that contradicts that is in the US, corporates are usually quite comfortable actually with as generated and not so concerned about necessarily looking for baseload or volume firm solutions. I think there's a real mix there. But do you see any kind of, I suppose, do you acknowledge that possibly the US is maybe a more buyer-centric market because it's a more established competitive market than we're seeing in some of the emerging markets in Europe? And what trends do you see in those risk allocations, if you would please?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, we've had procurement of solar for quite some time now from corporates in the US. You're right. It is a pretty advanced market. And some of those corporates have figured out the ways to shift risk. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really a business's job, is to try to minimize risk. And so, unfortunately, it's it's typically borne by the seller then at that point, which is us. But we try to collaborate with them of finding ways to reduce risk on both sides. And so one trend that I've seen is that there's increasing security requirements. And so pre COD and then post COD, so pre operations and then post operations. And those can be, pretty high and pretty staggering, and they can impact, our overall economics, as well as tie up developers' ability to grow their businesses, because you have to carry that cost through the life of the asset.
Yeah.
So, I think it's important for both buyers and sellers to talk to each other and talk about, the end of the day, we all want to build projects and we want to build as many renewables as possible. And so we should try to continue to find ways to balance that. And then on the other side, I think the other risks that are coming in is there are different types of products that are being created. You're right. There was typically just the typical as generated PPA. And really, what does that mean? That means that we can go and whatever we generate with the sun, we sell to them. And that is an easier contract from our side. Now we're seeing more creative contracts like hedges or, products indexed to market, or proxy gen PPAs, which are actually, basing the actual contract on the actual solar generation or their radiation, not even the generation. And so, it gets pretty interesting when you get creative there, because it's about balancing risk. And that's a good example of, it's a little bit more balanced than a hedge, for instance, because then you're actually, a hedge, you're fixing the actual shape, and you're committing to that shape. And that's challenging when you have an intermittent resource like solar. But then if you get something like a proxy gen PPA, at least you're counting for the weather. You're accounting for it. And so you're reducing that risk on our side as well.
Yeah, and I think it sort of brings home to me that there are many instances where a buyer might say, I want something in a box, I want something that looks like this, and they maybe assessing the risk and the cost and valuing those risks in a certain way. And from a seller side, we're looking at completely sort of diametrically opposed positions, saying, actually, we can be really flexible. We don't necessarily want to produce one in this box, because if we changed it very slightly to a different color box, we would value risks in a way that's different, and as such be able to produce a more competitive, compelling product that maybe the buyer could get comfortable with. So I do believe there's something really strong there around working together to overcome these solutions, rather than just necessarily going down the list of risks and going, right, well, you hold that one, we'll hold that one, and this is what they cost and how we'll allocate that. And as we're
Definitely.
working challenging environment where pricing isn't easy, it's something we really have to work together to overcome. So just sort of trying to wrap up, Emily, and I do appreciate your time for this transatlantic conversation. What do you see for the sort of medium and long term future? So Anything else kind of new coming, or what's your confidence in the market globally? And I'll just sort of pick up for me. I'm super excited about the development of new markets. I think Italy is a growing PPA market for us, corporate PPA market, and other markets in Europe are beginning to adopt this as a standard way. I'm really excited about growing um, the, the growing groups of corporates who are interested in these products, and how we can look to adapt our product to meet their needs, and to generate the opportunity to build more renewables, but also other markets globally. Brazil, Australia, those are growing, and we're seeing demand and opportunity there. And this, this what started 12, 15 years ago as a fairly niche product is now fairly mainstream, and it's super exciting to see that for me. But what do you see in the future, and what gets you excited in PPAs?
Great question. I think what you just said is really where I'm excited. I think the opportunities for big players that are on the corporate side that are global, to pick up, a contract that they're familiar with because it's, a contract with, for instance, Lightsource BP in Italy, and it can be the same or similar as in Australia or in Brazil or the US. And I think that that's a really good opportunity to get to scale. Even though we on a day-to-day basis feel like solar is definitely a part of the market and it's a massive part, it's still a little bit, it's still a small portion of the overall energy mix. And so the more that we become mainstream, and that's happening now, the investment is happening. There's more renewables investment, than there is coal. I mean, that's a massive change this year. And I think that that's an example of the shift in the market. And the more that renewables become standard and people are familiar with it and they're used to seeing it, it's going to become mainstream.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for your contribution today, and having this conversation. And I'm too very excited and look forward to working with you on some future PPA opportunities. And I agree with you entirely. The scale of the opportunity we've got and the speed of the transition is making working here very exciting at the moment. Is making working in the PPA market exciting. Thank you.